Jim, for joining us on this inaugural episode of To My Way of Thinking. You and I have known each other for a better part of about 3 decades, maybe more than that now as I look upon my life. And I've always been impressed by your writings and your point of view about Jacksonville history, education, and in fact, Florida history as it plays into that and how it plays even into national history. And I wanted to have everyone to get yet another chance to hear from one of the more profound thinkers, I think, in our society today, James B. Crooks. So tell us a bit about who is James Crooks.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Fred. It's a pleasure to be here and chatting with you. Let's call him Jim Crooks. Who's Jim Crooks? I'm a Yankee from New Jersey and went to college up north, Yale and Johns Hopkins, got a PhD and taught various places and came down to Jacksonville in 1972, 50 years ago. We're celebrating now to teach at UNF as it opened. I set up the history program at the University of North Florida and taught there for 29 years, retiring in 2001. Mm-hmm. Besides, and you mentioned the fact that I wrote 2 books about Jacksonville history. I've also written one about UNF and earlier a doctoral dissertation about Baltimore, Maryland, where I was living at the time. But equally important to the teaching and the scholarship and the writing has been involvement in the community. I have felt ever since 1963, I had the opportunity to take part in the March on Washington with Martin Luther King and John Lewis and all the other greats. And I was a viewer, not a participant, but I was one of 250,000 people that celebrated that wonderful, memorable day. And it was a turning point in my life. I had been relatively unaware of race relations. I grew up in a town that was predominantly white, a suburban New Jersey town. And I went to a college that was predominantly white and a graduate school. So I didn't have much contact with African Americans until the march, and in Baltimore after that, when I started getting involved, and subsequently in Roanoke, Virginia, and here in Jacksonville. And I've done it through several different ways. One through my church. I'm a Presbyterian, and through that we got involved in Pine Forest in the early 1990s, I think it was. Later, we got involved in Springfield with establishing the sanctuary on 8th Street that has flourished now for 30 years. I was involved for about 15 years. I got particularly involved with JCCI, Jacksonville Community Council, which that may be where we met, dealing with community issues and including 2 particularly important sessions on race relations in the 1990s and early 2000s. And in the writing that you referenced earlier on, the 2 Jacksonville After the Fire and Jacksonville Consolidation Story, I made a point to be inclusive in trying to understand not only the development of Jacksonville as a whole, but Jacksonville as a community in 1900 that was more than 50% Black. And a Jacksonville in the 1960s that was seeking to overcome Jim Crow with the Accidental Riot and other events of that decade and afterwards. So I feel like I've been involved both academically and in the community and as a citizen and activist, if you will, pretty much in a nonpartisan way in order to promote social justice, which I think is fundamental to what our ideals should be for Jacksonville, the state of Florida, United States, or globally, if we could speak that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, along those lines, Duval County and Florida history, what's the 3 things that stand out for you in the history since you've moved down here? You're a northerner who moved down here. I won't call you a carpetbagger, but a northerner who moved down this way. What are 3 things that have struck you about the history as you've seen it for Duval and Florida history?
It's interesting you ask it in those terms because in the book, Jacksonville, the Consolidation Story, I have three major themes. One is what happens to downtown. Two, what happens to the environment, focusing on the St. Johns River and beyond. And three, what's happened in race relations in Jacksonville. And there's three separate stories there that in one way or another I've been somewhat involved with over the last 50 years. And I see them going forward as being the most important stories to look forward to in Jacksonville. I mean, what's going to happen with the environment and global warming? What's going to happen downtown, if anything? What's going to happen in race relations? Are we ever going to achieve some kind of equity, and how do we move in that direction, particularly with things like systemic racism?
Well, one observation of your book wrote this: Crooks' study also examines the difficult years that immediately preceded consolidation. During the early and mid 1980s, Jacksonville was a city in decline with an unenviable reputation for bitter race relations, poor schools, polluted air and water, and an outdated and crumbling urban infrastructure. How the city's political and business leaders, including the regional power broker named Ed Ball here, convinced the leaders and inhabitants of Duval County's overwhelmingly white suburbs to accept consolidation is a remarkable story of negotiation and persuasion, a story that Crooks relates in fascinating detail. Now, I would also include in there the participation and the convincing of Jacksonville's Black community to endorse the issue of consolidation. How did you view the persuasiveness of there? I think Ed Ball might have been one of the persons involved in that, but I'm sure there were many others. So let's talk a bit about consolidation, getting Jacksonville, because we're one of the few consolidated cities in the country, as I can.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Nashville, Louisville, Indianapolis, and a couple more. The key Ed Ball was pretty much out of the picture by this time, but a guy named J.J. Daniel, you may remember him. Newspaper publisher and University Regent, and generally, and he coordinated or chaired the consolidation committee through its whole process, and working with a young fellow named Lex Hester, who you also may remember, sharp, very bright young man, put together the committees and the efforts to sell it to both the white and Black Jacksonville. You know, there have been efforts at annexation before in the preceding decade of Arlington and places like that, that all of them failed. And the idea, well, the conditions so bad as you suggest. We had the most polluted city in the state. We had an educational system where the high schools were disaccredited. Race relations were at a nadir. The civil rights movement had begun here with Axe Handle Saturday and subsequent events, but not much progress had been made because the mayor and the newspapers and everybody else ignored it as best they could in the white community. And then you had the corruption that's in city council and the city commission. So the city was in a mess, as you rightly described. And it was interesting that the chamber proposed consolidation. And as I've rethought this time and again since I wrote the book in the early 2000s, and you know, Jack Daniel tried to come up with a compromise on race relations. Earl Johnson was on the committee, as you may know, and there were several other African Americans, and they worked out the deal where they guaranteed X number of council seats, and they promised to build a decent infrastructure in the inner city, which never came to fruition, but it was in the consolidation covenant or law. So there was an attempt to reach out to the Black community, and ironically, it worked, because when the vote came in, I think it was about 60% of the Black community supported and 40% were opposed. And there was not only Earl Johnson, but Sally Mathis campaigned strongly for it in the Black community. There were others. Mary Singleton opposed it, and there were others who opposed it, but because she fundamentally, I don't think, trusted what would happen with consolidation. And my most recent thoughts about it is that it was what consolidation did was give power to the suburbs. You know, the Mandarins, the Arlingtons, the Beaches, etc. It was supposed to balance the power between Black and white, but it gave it to the white community. And so that dollars went into infrastructure to build sewers and roads and schools and firehouses in Mandarin and Arlington and in the southwest part of the county, but it didn't go to the inner city as was promised. And again, you have that because the majority of the council members are from the suburbs. If you look at the council distribution in the districts, you know, they're mostly suburban districts. And so it follows that the way it was, and I don't know whether it was intentioned that way or not. I mean, I know that there were certain people that voted for consolidation to dilute the Black vote. There were certain people who voted against consolidation because they were fearful of being included in the old city. But regardless of which was the dominant feeling, the reality was that the suburbs controlled Jacksonville thereafter. And the suburbs were predominantly white, and they followed the pattern of white voters across the country, and ignoring the Black, the poor, those in bad health, and the correlation, of course, was very close.
As best you can determine, was our version of, I may be incorrect, was our version of the Missouri Compromise allowing Baldwin and the Beaches in particular to retain their own governmental structure? They have their own police department, they have their own mayor, separate from the city of Jacksonville, whereby the city council of Jacksonville is effectively the city commission for the entire county. So was that our version of the Missouri Compromise in allowing them to self-govern in a way, but look to the county to support whatever they wanted?
That's one way of putting it, and I don't think if the initial draft did not provide autonomy for the Beaches and Baldwin, but through compromise, that negotiations that took place after that first draft, there was provision made that Beaches and Baltimore would determine their own future as cities or villages within the county structure, so that they, as you say, they have Jacksonville as their county, but they have their own police and fire and pride, if you will, as being Atlantic Beach or Neptune Beach or whatever. So I think the compromise was in letting them have their autonomy, and they're happier with it. Whether it hurt the overall consolidation, not as hard to say, because they still pay their taxes to the city. They have a higher tax rate because they have two levels of government, a city government, a county government, whereas within the city where I live, we just have one government, which is the consolidated one.
Well, back then in the late 60s, early 70s, just about everybody was a Democrat for the most part. and party wasn't as big a deal as it is right now. But what is still a big deal is the at-large council concept. And while we can't really argue, racial injustice on the at-large system, because as we sit right now, both the president and the vice president of the city council are both African Americans. But do we really need the at-large system that was also part of this compromise?
I think that's up for grabs. There have been arguments across the country whether government should be all at-large representation. And at one point in Jacksonville's history, it was true here. And that ignored segments of the community, particularly the African American community. The argument for citywide or countywide representation is one that hopefully it would provide a bigger picture, that if these 5 council members would have will be less tied to local interests and be more willing to look at the broad spectrum of where the city's going. Now, I don't see an awful lot of evidence of that in the history of consolidation, where the at-large, whether they have had a larger perspective, if you will. I think someone like Tommy Hazuri may have had, and maybe Matt Carlucci has, but there have been other council members who've been closely tied in with the lobbies, particularly the development lobbies, to make sure that new construction is easily financed and opened up and out in the burbs, out in the suburbs.
Economic and racial injustice continue to be a hallmark of what happens around Duval County, and I dare say other cities, particularly in the South. How much progress are we making to correct this? Yes, we have a number of African Americans in seats in positions in government, both appointed and elected now, that have done that. As I indicated, both of the current, as we speak today, both of the at-large, both of the leaders of the city council, both African Americans, both elected at large. Ironically, both are Republicans. But is the racial and economic injustice, is that still a major issue for our city and county?
I would say so. Yes, very much so. This is a personal feeling. I don't think that the Black community has organized itself as well as some Black communities in Atlanta and other cities have done towards taking control. What strikes me is that Duval County voted for President Biden, and that was thanks to the Black vote. Duval County voted for the Democratic candidate for governor 4 years ago, and that was due to the Black vote. If we can, and I know Blacks vote at the same proportion that white voters vote nationally, and I guess locally too. But the point is, my feeling is they need to control the Democratic Party more than they do. You know, the Democratic Party locally has been notorious for its weakness and its lack of direction and its lack of ability to put candidates in office. I mean, there have been more Democrats registered locally than Republicans, and yet the Democrats can't seem to get their people elected.